Rancher buys a ghost town for $50 and finds Apache girl hanged at the gate. Tom Bennett had spent his entire life in the vast open lands of the American Southwest. His hands were rough from years of tending cattle, fixing fences, and working under the scorching sun. The land was his world, and he loved the quiet of the desert, the way the wind moved through the sagebrush, and the endless sky that seemed to stretch forever. Yet, despite his many acres of ranch, Tom always dreamed of something more unusual, something that had history, character, and perhaps a story or two hidden in its walls. He wanted land that was not just property, but a piece of the past waiting to be discovered. One hot afternoon, while sipping coffee on his porch and flipping through a small stack of local newspapers, Tom's eyes caught something that made him sit up a little straighter. A small ad, barely noticeable, read, "Ghost Town for sale, $50. All buildings included. Must see." He blinked, thinking he had misread it. $50? For an entire town? He rubbed his eyes and read it again. Yes, $50. Most people spent that on a single night in a motel, but here was a chance to own an entire town. The words ghost town stirred his imagination. A town abandoned by time, forgotten by everyone, full of history waiting to be uncovered. Tom was curious. He had heard stories about ghost towns scattered across Arizona, relics of the gold rush and old frontier days. Some had crumbling buildings, broken-down saloons, and empty houses that once echoed with laughter and life. Most people avoided these places, thinking they were lonely, dusty, or even dangerous. But for Tom, they were fascinating. He loved imagining the people who once lived there, the stories they carried, and the secrets the wind whispered through the empty streets. That evening, he began to plan. He would drive out to see this ghost town. He didn't know exactly what he would find, but that was part of the adventure. The idea of owning something so unusual excited him more than any ordinary land purchase ever could. He pictured himself wandering the streets of the town, exploring abandoned buildings and imagining the life it had once held. Maybe he could fix up one of the old houses, or perhaps use it as a retreat from the busy work of ranching. The next morning, Tom loaded his old pickup with supplies, water, snacks, a first aid kit, and a notebook for taking notes. The sun rose bright over the horizon as he started his journey. The road to the town was rough and dusty, twisting through dry hills and wide empty plains. As he drove, he thought about the people who must have once lived there. Families who had built their lives around a school, a general store, a church, and streets full of laughter. Now, all of that was gone, replaced by silence and dust. When he finally arrived, the sight took his breath away. The town was smaller than he had imagined, but it had a haunting charm. Buildings leaned slightly to one side, their paint long faded by the harsh sun. Windows were broken or missing, doors hung on rusty hinges, and the streets were lined with weeds that swayed in the wind. It was as if time had stopped here, leaving everything exactly as it had been when the last person walked away. Tom felt a shiver of excitement. He could almost hear echoes of the past, the sound of horse hooves on dirt roads, the chatter of neighbors, and the laughter of children playing near the old well. He stepped out of his truck and walked slowly through the streets, touching the walls of the old buildings and imagining what life must have been like here. There was the general store, with its shelves still holding a few dusty cans and bottles. The old schoolhouse stood at the corner, its bell tower leaning slightly. Tom could almost see the children sitting at tiny desks, their lessons interrupted by the ringing of the bell. He wondered what stories these walls could tell if they could speak. As he explored, he noticed small details that made him smile. A carved heart in a wooden door, initials scratched into a fence post, and a faded sign advertising a barber shop. Each detail made the town feel more real, more human. Despite the emptiness, there was a sense of life here, as if the town had simply paused, waiting for someone to come along and remember it. Tom's excitement grew with every step. He imagined cleaning up the streets, repairing the buildings, and maybe even hosting visitors who wanted to experience a real ghost town. The idea of owning such a place was thrilling. He pictured himself sitting on the porch of the old saloon, watching the sunset over the desert, feeling the history of the town around him. But as the sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the streets, Tom felt a subtle change in the air. The wind seemed colder, carrying with it a strange stillness. The town no longer felt just like a forgotten place full of history. It felt watched. He shook off the feeling, telling himself it was just his imagination. After all, ghost towns were supposed to feel eerie, and he had always loved a good adventure. He continued to explore, moving toward the main gate of the town. It was a large wooden structure, weathered and worn, standing like a sentinel at the edge of the property. The gate creaked slightly in the wind, and Tom felt a strange pull to go closer. He imagined what it must have been like for people to enter the town centuries ago, coming from distant lands in search of opportunity and a new life. Tom paused for a moment, looking around at the empty streets stretching behind him. The sun was low now, painting the town in shades of orange and gold. It was beautiful in a lonely, haunting way. He felt a deep connection to this place, a sense of wonder and respect for the lives that had once filled it. He knew that buying this town was more than just a financial decision. It was a chance to hold a piece of history in his hands, to preserve it and perhaps learn from it. As he turned to leave, thinking about returning the next day with supplies and tools to inspect the buildings more thoroughly, he felt a small thrill of anticipation. This was the beginning of something unusual, something that would change his life in ways he could not yet imagine. He had purchased a ghost town for $50, but he had also bought a mystery, a story waiting to unfold, and a connection to the past that no amount of money could truly measure. Tom drove back toward his ranch as the sun disappeared behind the mountains, feeling both excited and thoughtful. He couldn't stop thinking about the town, the empty streets, and the history that lingered in every broken window and leaning wall. The ghost town was his now, and he knew that it would not just be a property on a map. It would become a part of his life, a chapter he had yet to write. That night, as he sat on his porch under the stars, he couldn't help but wonder about the lives that had passed through that town. He imagined families gathering for meals, children running through the streets, and neighbors sharing stories by the fire. He also felt a strange sense of unease, a whisper in the back of his mind that perhaps the town held more than just memories. He pushed the thought aside, telling himself that curiosity and courage were part of every adventure. Little did Tom know the ghost town was not entirely empty. There were secrets waiting to be uncovered, stories that refused to stay buried, and events that would challenge everything he thought he knew about the quiet, deserted land he had just bought. For now, though, he allowed himself to dream. He dreamed of restoration, of discovery, and of being the caretaker of a place where the past and present might meet. And so, with a heart full of curiosity and a mind buzzing with possibilities, Tom Bennett prepared for what would become the most unusual and unforgettable chapter of his life. $50 had bought him more than land. It had bought him a journey into history, mystery, and the unknown. The ghost town, silent and still, awaited his return, ready to reveal the stories that had lingered in its streets for decades. The next morning, Tom woke up before sunrise, his mind still filled with thoughts of the ghost town. He felt a mix of excitement and curiosity, but there was also a small, uneasy feeling he could not shake. He told himself it was just the quiet, lonely desert playing tricks on him. Still, he packed his truck carefully, bringing extra water, a flashlight, and even a small first aid kit. He wanted to be prepared for anything. The drive to the town felt different this time. The road seemed emptier, quieter, and even the wind sounded softer, almost like it was holding its breath. Tom thought about the streets, the old buildings, and the stories he had imagined the day before. He wondered if he would finally start to uncover the secrets the town had kept hidden for decades. As he approached the outskirts, the town came into view. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the dusty streets. Everything looked more mysterious in this early morning light. The old wooden buildings seemed to lean toward each other, as if whispering to one another. Tom parked his truck and stepped out, feeling the crunch of gravel beneath his boots. The air smelled dry and faintly of sagebrush, carrying the scent of the desert that stretched endlessly around him. Tom walked slowly toward the main gate. His heart began to beat a little faster. There was a strange, silent tension in the air, as if the town was waiting for him. He noticed the gate's old wood and rusty hinges, and for a moment he felt a sense of respect for the people who had built it all those years ago. It had been a grand entrance once, welcoming travelers, families, and traders into a lively town. Now it stood alone, guarding the secrets of the past. But as he came closer, something stopped him in his tracks. At the gate there was a figure, something that made his stomach tighten and his mind freeze. It was a young girl, hanging from the post of the gate. She was small, thin, and still dressed in traditional Apache clothing. Her face was pale and peaceful, but the sight was horrifying. Tom's hands shook, and he had to take a step back to breathe. For a moment he couldn't believe what he was seeing. His first instinct was disbelief. How could this be? The town was supposed to be abandoned, forgotten by the world! And yet, here was a girl, someone very real, very alive at some point, but now tragically gone. He looked around, expecting someone to appear, someone who might explain what had happened. But the streets were empty. The buildings were silent. Only the wind moved through the town, carrying a whisper of the past, and a chill ran down his spine. Tom's mind raced. Should he call the authorities immediately? Was it safe to go closer? His heart pounded as he slowly approached, careful not to disturb anything. The girl's features were delicate, her hair dark and long, framing her small face. It was impossible to tell how long she had been there, but the image was seared into Tom's memory. He felt a mix of sorrow, fear, and disbelief. How had this happened in a place that should have been empty? As he stood there, trying to process what he was seeing, Tom noticed small signs that the town was not as abandoned as it seemed. Near the gate, there were footprints in the dusty ground, fresh and clear. They led away from the main street toward one of the old buildings. Tom realized that someone had been here recently, someone who had perhaps been involved in the girl's death. He shivered, understanding that this was no ordinary discovery. Tom reached for his phone with trembling hands and dialed the local sheriff's office. The voice on the other end was calm, but Tom could hear the seriousness in it. Within an hour, law enforcement arrived, along with a few local historians who had studied the town. Tom stepped back, trying to give them space, feeling a mixture of relief and anxiety. He wanted answers, but he also feared what those answers might reveal. The investigators examined the scene carefully. They took notes, photographs, and began to search the surrounding area. Tom watched, feeling like an intruder in a tragedy he had stumbled upon. The girl's identity remained a mystery at first. No one seemed to know who she was or why she had been there. The officers questioned Tom, asking if he had noticed anything unusual the previous day, but he had seen nothing, only the empty streets and the quiet buildings.
As the morning passed, Tom learned more about the town's dark history.
The historians spoke quietly among themselves, telling stories of the Apache people, the settlers, and the struggles that had taken place here over a century ago. There had been disputes over land, small skirmishes, and tragedies that were never fully recorded. The town had been abandoned for decades, but it seemed that its history had not been entirely forgotten. Someone had returned, and now the past had intersected with the present in the most shocking way. Tom could not help but feel a deep sense of guilt. He had come here thinking only of adventure and curiosity, but now he was confronted with a stark reality. This was not a simple historical exploration. This was real, and it was tragic. The girl's presence, her life cut short, made him realize that the ghost town still held dangers, mysteries, and perhaps even secrets that people would go to great lengths to hide. Despite the fear, Tom's curiosity did not fade. He began to walk slowly through the town again, observing the buildings, the streets, and the spaces where people once lived. Each step was heavy with the knowledge that the past was not gone. It lingered here, in the wind, in the dust, and in the walls of the old buildings. He noticed broken windows, empty houses, and the remnants of furniture and tools. The town was a capsule of time, frozen, yet now disturbed by the tragic event at the gate. As he explored, Tom discovered small clues that made him wonder about the girl's story. Near the edge of the town, he saw signs of a recent fire in an old fireplace. Footprints led to and from the gate. A few buildings had doors slightly ajar, suggesting someone had moved through them recently. It became clear that the town had not been entirely forgotten by the world. Someone had returned, and their intentions were unclear, whether they had meant harm or were simply passing through. The more Tom explored, the more he realized that the town held stories that were difficult to uncover. Some were written in newspapers and old documents, others were carried in the memories of those who had long since moved away, but some stories were hidden, buried in silence and shadows, waiting for someone brave enough to face them. Tom knew that discovering the girl's story would not be easy. It would require patience, research, and perhaps collaboration with local historians and the Native American community. By the afternoon, Tom sat on the steps of the old saloon, trying to collect his thoughts. The sun was high, casting harsh shadows across the streets. He felt the weight of what he had discovered. The tragedy, the mystery, and the responsibility. He realized that owning the town was no longer just a simple adventure. It was a responsibility to understand, to remember, and perhaps to bring justice to the story that had unfolded here. He thought about the girl, her life, and the injustice that had brought her to this place. He felt a connection to her, though he did not know her name. She was a reminder that history was never truly gone, and that the past could reach into the present in ways that were both shocking and heartbreaking. Tom knew that the ghost town had more to reveal, and he was determined to uncover its secrets. As the day drew to a close, Tom returned to his truck, exhausted but resolute. He drove back toward his ranch, the image of the girl at the gate burning in his mind. He could not stop thinking about her, the town, and the mystery that had only just begun. He knew that his life had changed forever. The ghost town was no longer just a curiosity, it was a place of history, tragedy, and unanswered questions. That night, as Tom lay in bed, he could not sleep. He kept thinking about the streets, the buildings, and the girl. He realized that he would need to return, to explore more, and to work with the authorities to understand what had happened. The town had called to him, not just for its charm and history, but because it held the story that needed to be told. A story of life, death, and the echoes of the past reaching into the present. Tom fell asleep finally, but even in his dreams, he saw the ghost town. He saw the girl at the gate, and he felt the weight of responsibility pressing on him. He knew that the next visit would not be simple or safe. There would be discoveries, answers, and perhaps even danger. But he also knew that he could not ignore it. The town had chosen him as its keeper, and he would face whatever came next with courage and care. The next morning he prepared to return, ready to explore further and to uncover the truth that the ghost town held. He knew that this was only the beginning, and that the story of the town and the girl was far from finished. Every step he would take, every building he would enter, and every discovery he would make would bring him closer to understanding the mysteries of the past and to finding his place in the story that was unfolding before him. After the shocking discovery at the gate, Tom Bennett could not stop thinking about the young girl he had found. Her image haunted him, and every time he closed his eyes, he could see her face, delicate and innocent, framed by her dark hair. He knew he could not ignore what had happened. The ghost town he had purchased for $50 had suddenly become much more than an adventure or a curiosity. It was now tied to a real tragedy, and Tom felt a strong sense of responsibility to uncover the truth. The sheriff's office had arrived quickly after Tom called, and a small team of investigators began examining the town. Tom stayed nearby, watching closely as they worked, trying not to interfere but also hoping to learn something. The officers moved with careful precision, taking photographs of every detail, marking footprints in the dust, and carefully noting the condition of the girl's clothing. Tom listened as they discussed the case in low, serious voices, realizing that this situation was far more complicated than he had imagined. The girl's identity remained unknown. At first, investigators wondered if she had wandered into the ghost town by accident or if she had been left there deliberately. There were no signs of a struggle nearby, no footprints leading away from the gate, except a few that had returned to the town's main street. Everything suggested that someone had brought her there, but why or who remained a mystery. Tom felt a chill every time he thought about it. This was no longer just an empty town with stories from the past. This was a place that had seen real, recent suffering. The historians who had accompanied the sheriff began sharing what they knew about the town's long history. Tom listened with growing fascination and unease. The town had once been a bustling settlement during the late 1800s, with families living side by side, raising children and running small businesses. It had a school, a general store, a saloon, and a church. But the town had also seen violence, particularly during the conflicts between settlers and the Apache people. Skirmishes over land, resources, and survival had left scars, and some tragedies were never recorded properly. Many families had disappeared or moved on, leaving behind the empty streets that Tom now walked. As the investigation progressed, it became clear that the town's past was connected to its present. The girl's death was not an isolated incident. The investigators found evidence suggesting that someone had used the town as a temporary hiding place. They discovered signs of small fires in fireplaces, footprints in the dust, and remnants of food left behind. It seemed the town had been visited recently, despite being officially abandoned. Tom felt a knot of fear in his stomach. If someone had been here after it was deserted, what else might they be capable of? And could they still be around? Despite the fear, Tom's curiosity would not let him step back completely. He began walking through the town again, carefully observing every building and street corner. The old saloon still had broken furniture inside, the wooden bar worn smooth from years of use. In the schoolhouse, dust-covered desks sat in neat rows. An old blackboard still held faded chalk writing. Tom could almost imagine the sounds of life. Children laughing, neighbors talking, horses clattering down the main street. But the reality was harsh and silent. While exploring, Tom noticed small clues that hinted at the girl's recent presence. In one abandoned house, he found a few personal belongings, small, fragile items that had not yet been disturbed. A necklace, a tiny carved figurine, and a piece of cloth that matched the kind of clothing she had worn. Tom realized that someone had tried to hide her story, but the objects remained as silent witnesses. He carefully photographed them, intending to share the details with the investigators. Each discovery made the reality of the situation even harder to process. This was not a story frozen in time. It was still happening, and someone had been responsible. As the day wore on, the investigation took a deeper turn. The sheriff and his team began digging into the town's historical records, trying to connect the current tragedy to past events. They discovered that the ghost town had a long record of being used by outsiders after it was abandoned. Some came to look for lost treasures or hidden property, while others had darker intentions, exploiting the town's isolation. Stories of unexplained disappearances, small crimes, and unsolved mysteries painted a picture of a place where history and danger had intertwined. Tom listened with growing concern, realizing that the town's charm had always been mixed with shadows. The historians explained that the town had also been a witness to injustice. The Apache people had suffered greatly during the conflicts with settlers. Families had been displaced, and some had vanished mysteriously. Unrecorded violence had left scars that were still felt today. Tom understood that the girl's presence was not only a tragic event, but also a reminder that the town's history of suffering had not fully ended. The past and present had collided in a way he had never expected. Tom found himself torn between fear and fascination. The town was dangerous, but he could not look away. Each step he took, each building he entered, seemed to reveal another layer of the story. The small details, the way a door swung slightly in the wind, a faded photograph on a wall, footprints leading nowhere, built a picture of a place alive with stories, some joyful, some sorrowful, and some frightening. He felt that he was becoming part of the town's history, not just an observer, and the weight of that responsibility pressed on him. As night approached, the team of investigators prepared to leave, planning to return the next day with more equipment. Tom stayed behind for a moment, standing at the main street looking up and down the empty lanes. The sun set in fiery reds and golds over the mountains, and the shadows grew long and mysterious. He thought about the girl, wondering who she had been, what her life had been like, and why her story had ended here. He promised himself that he would not let her memory be forgotten. That night, Tom camped near the town, unable to leave immediately. He lit a small fire and sat quietly, listening to the wind whisper through the empty buildings. Every sound seemed amplified. The rustling of leaves, the creaking of wood, the distant call of a coyote. It was both beautiful and unsettling. He could almost feel the presence of the past, as if the town itself was watching him, waiting for him to uncover its secrets. He thought about the lives that had once filled the town. Families, children, shopkeepers, teachers, all gone, leaving only the echoes of their existence. And now, this young girl had been added to that long list of lives disrupted and ended too soon. Tom felt a deep sense of responsibility. Owning the town was no longer a simple curiosity or investment. He had become the guardian of a place that demanded respect, care, and attention. The following morning, Tom returned to the town with a renewed sense of purpose. He walked carefully, retracing the steps of the investigators, observing the footprints, and examining the areas that had not yet been thoroughly explored. Each detail added to the growing understanding of what had happened. The girl's story, though incomplete, was beginning to take shape. Tom realized that he could help preserve not only the physical town but also the memory of those who had lived, suffered, and, in some cases, been forgotten. Tom began to document everything meticulously. He took photographs, wrote notes, and even began sketching maps of the town and the areas where evidence had been found. He felt like an explorer, but one burdened with the seriousness of real life and death. Every corner held a potential clue, and every building seemed to speak in its own quiet way. The ghost town, which had once been a dream and an adventure, had become a place of investigation, memory, and responsibility. As the days passed, the investigation continued to reveal the town's secrets. Tom worked closely with the authorities and historians, piecing together fragments of the past and present. They discovered more evidence of recent visits to the town, as well as connections to the long history of injustice toward the Apache people. Tom understood that the town's story was not only about what had happened to the young girl, but also about the broader history of struggle, displacement, and resilience. Through it all, Tom felt a mixture of fear, sorrow, and determination. The ghost town had tested his courage, his curiosity, and his sense of responsibility. But he also felt a deep connection to the place, to the people who had lived there, and to the young girl whose life had ended tragically. He knew that uncovering the truth would be difficult, but he was committed to seeing it through. The town had chosen him as its caretaker, and he would not let its stories be forgotten. By the end of Part 3, Tom had become fully immersed in the investigation. The ghost town was no longer just a place to explore. It was a living memory, a puzzle of history and tragedy that demanded attention. Tom understood that the journey he had begun with curiosity and adventure had become a mission of understanding, remembrance, and respect. Every step forward would reveal more, and every discovery would bring him closer to the truth that lay hidden in the town's silent streets. Tom Bennett returned to the ghost town with a sense of purpose that went beyond curiosity. After discovering the young Apache girl at the gate and seeing the town's long, troubled history, he realized that the place was more than just an abandoned settlement. It was a living memory, holding stories that demanded to be uncovered. He felt a mixture of fear and responsibility, knowing that each step he took might bring him closer to understanding the mystery, but could also reveal truths that were painful and unsettling. The investigators had returned with more equipment and a careful plan. Tom followed them as they methodically searched the town, checking each building and corner for evidence. Broken furniture, empty rooms, and dust-covered floors all hinted at a long-forgotten life, but signs of recent human activity reminded everyone that the town was not entirely abandoned. Footprints, fresh ashes in old fireplaces, and small pieces of cloth suggested that someone had been there in the days or weeks before the girl's death. Tom felt a chill as he realized that the past and present were intersecting in the town in ways no one could have anticipated. One of the historians, a woman named Margaret Hayes, began explaining the deeper history of the town. She told Tom and the investigators that this ghost town had been a hub for settlers during the late 1800s, but it had also been a place of tension and violence. Conflicts between settlers and the Apache people had left scars that were never fully healed. Families had been displaced and some individuals had disappeared without explanation. The town had been abandoned gradually, but legends of its dark past had persisted. Margaret's words made Tom feel that the young girl's death was not simply an accident. It might be connected to patterns of secrecy and lawlessness that had existed for generations. As they moved from building to building, Tom noticed signs of careful disturbance. Books moved from their shelves, small tools missing, and traces of footprints leading through buildings that had been empty for decades. He wondered if someone had been using the town as a hiding place or a secret meeting spot. The idea made him uneasy. The thought that someone could commit a crime in such an isolated location, where no one would notice for days or even weeks, was frightening. He felt a renewed sense of responsibility for the town, realizing that he now owned not just land, but a story that needed protection and understanding. The team found more clues in the old saloon. A set of footprints led to the back room, where a broken chair lay on the floor. A few personal items, such as a scarf and a small carved figure, suggested that someone had been living here temporarily. The items were carefully preserved, but they added to the growing sense that the town was still being used for reasons that were not entirely innocent. Tom examined them closely, thinking about the girl and how she might have encountered the person responsible for her death. The reality of the situation weighed heavily on him, and he realized that uncovering the truth would not be easy. In the schoolhouse, Tom and the historians discovered old records and newspapers stored in a small, hidden cabinet. Most of the documents were dusty and fragile, but they contained details of past events, births, marriages, and deaths that had occurred in the town, as well as reports of disputes and unexplained disappearances. Some of the stories involved the Apache community and their struggles with settlers who had moved into the area. As Tom read the records, he began to understand that the town's history was a mixture of everyday life, joy, sorrow, and unresolved conflict. The ghost town was more than empty buildings. It was a reflection of the lives, struggles, and injustices that had shaped the region. Margaret pointed out patterns in the records that seemed connected to the present. She noted that the town had always been a place where outsiders could arrive without being noticed, and that some individuals had taken advantage of this isolation for selfish or harmful purposes. The young girl's death, tragic as it was, fit into a long history of people using the town for secretive reasons. Tom shivered at the thought, realizing that the ghost town's charm had always been intertwined with danger. The past had not fully disappeared. It had been waiting quietly for someone to uncover it. While exploring one of the houses, Tom noticed graffiti carved into the wooden walls, initials, dates, and small symbols that he did not recognize. Some were decades old, others more recent. The symbols suggested that people had used the town as a secret space for messages, perhaps warning each other or marking events that no one else should see. Tom photographed the carvings, understanding that they might be clues to uncovering what had happened to the young girl. Each mark seemed to whisper a story, waiting for someone patient and observant enough to listen. As the day progressed, the investigation began to reveal connections between the town's past and the present tragedy. The historians explained that many towns in the region had been built without proper oversight or protection, leaving them vulnerable to misuse. The isolation that once made the town appealing to settlers now made it a convenient place for secrets to be kept and crimes to go unnoticed. Tom felt a growing sense of unease. He had bought the town thinking it would be an adventure, but now he realized that owning it also meant facing the darker side of its history. The sheriff and his team also worked to identify the girl. They found traces of her presence beyond the gate, footprints leading to a small hidden area behind one of the houses. There, they discovered personal belongings that suggested she had been alive in the town for at least a short period before her death. The investigators took careful notes and photographs, treating every detail as potentially important. Tom watched, realizing that the ghost town was more complex than he had ever imagined. It was a place where history, tragedy, and mystery converged, and it demanded careful attention. Tom began to feel a personal connection to the town and its stories. He realized that he could not simply treat it as property or a curiosity. The young girl, the history of the Apache community, and the long-forgotten lives that had once filled the streets had placed a moral responsibility on him. He began keeping detailed notes, recording everything he observed and thinking about ways to preserve the town while also honoring the people who had been affected by its history. For the first time, he understood that owning land carried weight far beyond money or investment. By evening, the team decided to leave, planning to return the next day with more resources and experts. Tom stayed behind for a moment, walking slowly through the streets, touching the walls and listening to the wind. The sun cast long shadows across the empty town, and the silence was profound. He felt a mixture of sorrow and determination. The town had chosen him as its caretaker, and he understood that he could not ignore what he had discovered. The past and present were intertwined here, and he had a role to play in uncovering and preserving the truth. That night, Tom camped near the town, sitting by a small fire and thinking about everything he had learned. The wind whispered through the buildings, carrying echoes of the past. He imagined families gathering for meals, children running through the streets, and neighbors sharing stories by the fire. He also thought about the young girl and the tragic circumstances of her death. The ghost town, silent and lonely, had become a place of reflection, learning, and responsibility. Tom realized that every discovery, no matter how small, was a step toward understanding the town's story and giving voice to those who had been forgotten. In the days that followed, Tom and the investigators continued to piece together the history and the mystery. They found more evidence of recent visits to the town, patterns of behavior that suggested someone had been using it for secretive purposes. At the same time, historical records provided insight into the town's complex past, including the struggles of the Apache people and the conflicts that had shaped the region. Tom began to see the town not just as a place of tragedy, but as a place of learning, reflection, and remembrance. Through it all, Tom's feelings grew more complex. He was fearful of what might still be hidden in the town, but he was also deeply committed to uncovering the truth. The ghost town had transformed from a simple adventure into a mission of understanding, remembrance, and care. Every footprint, every broken window, and every personal item told a story, and Tom knew that he could not turn away. He had become part of the town's history, a witness and guardian of its secrets. By the end of Part 4, Tom had come to a new understanding of the town. It was no longer simply a ghost town or a curiosity. It was a place where the past and present met, where lives and stories had intersected in ways that demanded attention and respect. Tom realized that the journey he had begun with excitement and adventure had become something far greater, a mission to uncover, preserve, and honor the lives connected to this place. He felt a sense of purpose that went beyond ownership or curiosity. The ghost town had chosen him as its caretaker, and he would face whatever discoveries lay ahead with courage, respect, and determination.
The days after the investigation were long and quiet for Tom Bennett, but he felt a sense of purpose he had never experienced before.
The ghost town he had purchased for $50 was no longer just an empty curiosity. It had become a place of memory, responsibility, and reflection. Every building, every broken window, and every footprint told a story, and he realized that it was his duty to honor those stories, especially the story of the young Apache girl he had discovered at the gate. Her presence had awakened something in him, a deep understanding that this place was not just land but a witness to lives, struggles, and history that demanded respect. Tom began coordinating with the sheriff, the historians, and local members of the Apache community. Together, they discussed ways to preserve the town and honor its history. He learned that while the girl's identity might never be fully known, her memory could be respected. They planned a small memorial near the main gate where the girl had been found, with flowers, stones, and a plaque to remind visitors that the town held stories that should never be forgotten. Tom felt a sense of relief knowing that even in tragedy, the town could serve as a place of remembrance and learning. As the memorial took shape, Tom walked through the streets of the ghost town, observing every building and corner with renewed attention. The old schoolhouse, which had once echoed with children's laughter, now held careful displays of photographs, historical documents, and small artifacts that told the story of life in the town. The general store, though still dusty and weathered, had items arranged to show what people had once bought, how they had lived, and how the town had functioned as a community. Tom realized that by preserving these details, he was keeping the memories alive, allowing the town to speak for those who had been silenced by time. The historians and the Apache community members shared stories that had been passed down through generations. They spoke of families who had once lived in the town, of struggles to survive in the harsh desert environment, and of the injustices they had faced. Tom listened closely, absorbing every detail. He felt a deep connection to the people who had walked these streets before him, understanding that the town was more than buildings. It was a living record of human experience, full of joy, sorrow, courage, and resilience. Through his work, Tom also began to understand the broader significance of the ghost town. It was a place where history and memory intersected, where the past had a voice that demanded to be heard. He realized that the young girl's death, tragic as it was, had brought attention to this history, reminding everyone that even forgotten places could hold powerful lessons. Tom felt a responsibility not just to the town, but to the broader community, to ensure that the stories of injustice, survival, and life were not lost. Tom also took practical steps to protect the town. He repaired doors, reinforced weak walls, and cleared debris from the streets. He wanted to make sure that the town remained safe for visitors who came to learn, reflect, and honor its history. At the same time, he preserved the signs of age and decay, understanding that the weathered buildings and broken windows were part of the town's story. They were reminders of the passage of time and the lives that had come before. Every action he took was careful and deliberate, a balance between preservation and respect. As the weeks passed, the ghost town began to attract visitors. People came from nearby towns, historians, students, and members of the Apache community. They walked the streets quietly, taking in the history, reading the signs, and pausing at the memorial to the young girl. Tom watched them with a sense of pride and humility. He realized that the town had become a place of reflection and learning, a bridge between the past and the present. The girl's story, though tragic, had given the town new life, allowing her memory to become a part of something larger and meaningful. Tom also reflected on his own journey. He had purchased the town with curiosity and excitement, expecting an adventure filled with exploration and imagination. Instead, he had been confronted with tragedy, history, and moral responsibility. The experience had changed him, teaching him lessons about empathy, care, and the importance of remembering the past. He felt a deep respect for the lives that had come before him, and for the people who had guided him in understanding the town's significance. One evening, as the sun set over the desert, Tom stood at the main gate, looking out over the town. The shadows stretched across the streets, and the wind whispered through the buildings. He thought about the young girl, imagining her life and the struggles she had faced. He felt a connection to her, a promise that her story would not be forgotten. The town, once abandoned and silent, had become a place of memory, respect, and reflection. Tom understood that this was the true value of the town, not in its land or buildings, but in the lives and stories it preserved.
Over time, Tom continued to care for the ghost town, maintaining the memorial, organizing historical tours, and working with the Apache community to share their stories.
The town became known as a place where history was alive, where visitors could learn about the past, honor those who had suffered, and reflect on the resilience of human spirit. Tom felt a deep satisfaction in knowing that the town's stories were being told and that the young girl's memory had a place in the history of the region. Despite the challenges, Tom found joy in his work. He walked the streets with a sense of purpose, greeted visitors, and shared what he had learned. The town, once quiet and abandoned, now carried the voices of the past, the lessons of history, and the memories of those who had lived there. Every corner, every building, and every artifact became part of a larger story, a narrative that connected the past to the present in a meaningful way. In the evenings, Tom often sat on the porch of the old saloon. The desert air was cool and quiet, and the town seemed to settle into a peaceful rhythm. He thought about the journey that had brought him here, the purchase of the town, the shocking discovery at the gate, the investigation, and the process of uncovering and preserving the town's history. He realized that the experience had changed him deeply, teaching him about responsibility, compassion, and the power of memory. The ghost town, once bought for $50, had become so much more. It was a place of learning, remembrance, and respect. It was a place where the young girl's memory could live on, where the history of the Apache community could be honored, and where visitors could reflect on the lessons of the past. Tom understood that this was the true value of the town, not in its land or structures, but in the stories it held and the lives it touched. As time went on, Tom continued to care for the town with dedication and respect. He worked with historians, community members, and visitors to ensure that the town's stories were preserved and shared. He documented everything carefully, maintaining records of discoveries, memories, and historical details. The town became a symbol of resilience, reflection, and remembrance, a place where the past and present met in a meaningful way. Tom often thought about the young girl, wondering what her life had been like and how it had ended so tragically. He knew that her story, though painful, had brought attention to the town and its history. Her memory had become a part of the town's identity, a reminder that even forgotten places could hold powerful lessons. Tom felt a sense of peace, knowing that he had helped ensure that her story would not be lost, and that the town would continue to honor her and all those who had come before. In the end, Tom realized that owning the ghost town was about much more than land or property. It was about caring for history, honoring memories, and preserving the lessons of the past. The town had tested him, challenged him, and taught him important truths about responsibility, empathy, and respect. And in return, it had given him a sense of purpose, connection, and fulfillment that he had never experienced before. Standing at the main gate one last time as the sun dipped below the horizon, Tom felt a quiet sense of accomplishment. The ghost town, once silent and abandoned, had become a place of life, learning, and remembrance. The young girl's memory, the history of the Apache community, and the lives of those who had once lived there were no longer forgotten. Tom knew that he had played a part in preserving this history and that the town would continue to tell its stories for generations to come. The wind blew gently through the streets, carrying with it echoes of the past. Tom smiled softly, feeling a deep connection to the town and to the lives it held. He had begun his journey with curiosity and adventure, but he ended it with understanding, respect, and a sense of purpose. The ghost town, purchased for $50, had become a place where history lived, where memories were honored, and where the past and present came together in a meaningful and lasting way.